It is the winter of 1895, and inside the gilded ballrooms of New York's Fifth Avenue, a transaction is underway, one that will not be recorded in any ledger, yet will reshape the social architecture of two continents. The chandeliers burn hot with 10,000 candles. The champagne is French. The flowers have been shipped from the greenhouses of Long Island at a cost that would feed an entire tenement block for a month. And at the center of it all stands a young woman in white silk, her expression composed, her fate already decided. She is not yet 20 years old. She is worth $40 million. And within 6 months she will be a duchess. This is the story of the American heiresses. The dollar princesses, as the British press would mockingly and yet enviously call them. The daughters of the Gilded Age who carried the fortunes of railroad barons, copper kings, and oil magnates across the Atlantic and deposited them into the crumbling estates of impoverished European nobility. Between 1870 and 1914, more than 400 American women married into the titled aristocracy of Europe. They brought with them an estimated $500 million, the equivalent of nearly $17 billion in today's currency, pumped directly into the collapsing veins of the old world's grandest families. Over 400 American heiresses married European nobility between 1870 to 1914, transferring an estimated $500 million, roughly $17 billion today, across the Atlantic. They did not merely marry into history. They funded its continuation. The estates that would otherwise have crumbled into the English countryside were shored up by American railroad money. The ducal portraits that hang in stately homes today were preserved by copper fortunes extracted from the mountains of the American West. The very fabric of Edwardian aristocracy, its hunts and house parties, its diplomatic connections and parliamentary influence, was stitched together in no small part by women whose fathers had never set foot in a manor house. Yet history has largely forgotten them. They appear in footnotes, in society columns, in the occasional biography of the titled men they married. Their own stories, their ambitions, their loneliness, their extraordinary reinventions and heartbreaking accommodations, have been left to gather dust in the archives of two continents. This is their story. Before we continue, if stories like this deserve to be remembered, if the women history forgot deserve to have their names spoken again, then help me build a place where we tell them properly. I'm on the road to 1,000 subscribers. If you believe history is more than dates and dead men's titles, if you believe these stories matter, subscribe. Be part of the first 1,000 who choose depth over noise. Now let's continue. Chapter 1. The Architect's Daughter, Consuelo Vanderbilt. The most famous marriage in America. On the morning of November 6, 1895, in the nave of St. Thomas Church on Fifth Avenue, a young woman walked down the aisle in tears. The guests seated in the polished pews, senators, ambassadors, the cream of New York society, assumed the tears were those of a bride overcome by joy. They were not. Consuelo Vanderbilt, 18 years old, dark-eyed and breathtakingly beautiful, was weeping because she had been forced into the carriage that morning by her mother, Alva Vanderbilt, who had reportedly spent the prior night standing guard outside her daughter's bedroom door to ensure she could not flee. The man waiting at the altar was Charles Richard John Spencer Churchill, the 9th Duke of Marlborough. He was 24 years old, possessed of an ancient title, a magnificent palace, Blenheim, one of the grandest private residences in England, and almost no money whatsoever. The Marlborough dukedom, like so many of its kind, had been slowly suffocating beneath the weight of its own magnificence. The farms that had once supported Blenheim's 1,000 rooms had yielded diminishing returns for decades. The roof leaked. The walls were damp. The estate needed rescuing, and the Duke had come to New York to find a rescuer. He found one in Consuelo's mother. Alva Vanderbilt was a social architect of the first order, a woman who had clawed her own way from the fringes of New Orleans society to the absolute apex of American aristocracy, and who had not the slightest intention of allowing her daughter to stop climbing. The Vanderbilt fortune, built by Consuelo's grandfather Cornelius on railroads and steamships, was at the time among the largest in the United States. The family's combined wealth approached $200 million. But to Alva, money without a title was merely wealth. What she wanted for her daughter, and by extension for herself, was permanence. She wanted history. The settlement negotiated between the Vanderbilt and Marlborough families was staggering in its frankness. Consuelo brought with her a dowry of $2.5 million in cash, approximately $85 million today, plus a guaranteed annual income of $100,000 in perpetuity, to be paid by the Vanderbilt estate directly to the Duke of Marlborough. In exchange, Consuelo became a duchess. Her new husband gained everything necessary to restore Blenheim Palace to its former splendor. The rooms were refurnished, the leaking roofs repaired, 800 acres of park replanted, the household staff doubled. The palace that would one day become a UNESCO World Heritage Site was saved by American railroad money. Consuelo's dowry, $2.5 million cash plus $100,000 annual income, equivalent to roughly $85 million today. Blenheim Palace's restoration was funded almost entirely by Vanderbilt wealth. Consuelo herself spent the next 11 years in a marriage of profound, suffocating misery. She and the Duke had little in common beyond their mutual discomfort. He was cold, formal, obsessed with the protocol of his position. She was warm, intelligent, deeply curious, a woman who read philosophy for pleasure and spoke French with genuine fluency. At Blenheim she was expected to be decorative, to preside at dinners, to produce heirs, to embody the dignity of the Marlborough name. She produced 2 sons. She presided at the dinners. She embodied nothing of herself. The irony was exquisite and total. A woman whose personal freedom had been sacrificed to purchase the preservation of a palace would eventually become one of the most prominent advocates for women's suffrage in England. After separating from the Duke in 1906 and achieving an annulment in 1926, on the grounds that her consent to the marriage had been coerced, Consuelo threw herself into public life with the energy of someone who had spent decades in captivity. She campaigned for the vote. She founded schools. She sat on government committees. She wrote a memoir, The Glitter and the Gold, that remains one of the most candid accounts of the Dollar Princess experience ever committed to paper. Blenheim Palace still stands. The gardens Consuelo's money replanted still bloom each spring. But it is her later life, the life she chose, that history ought to remember. She purchased a palace with her freedom and then spent the rest of her life buying it back. Chapter 2, The Copper Queen's Daughter, Jennie Jerome. The woman who made a prime minister. Long before Consuelo Vanderbilt wept at the altar of St. Thomas Church, there was Jennie Jerome. And the story of Jennie Jerome is the story of how a New York financier's daughter from Madison Square became, in all but blood, the most consequential political force in late Victorian England. Jeanette Jerome was born in Brooklyn in 1854, the second of 3 daughters of Leonard Jerome, a Wall Street speculator of spectacular ambition and equally spectacular instability. Jerome's fortune rose and fell with the markets, and in the years following the Civil War he was riding one of its most dramatic ascents. He owned a controlling interest in the New York Times, he had built a private racetrack on the grounds of his estate, and he kept a second household for his mistress, the opera singer Clara Kellogg, with a frankness that would have destroyed a lesser man's reputation. In Leonard Jerome's world, wealth was performance and performance was everything. His daughter had absorbed the lesson completely. Jennie Jerome was not conventionally beautiful in the manner the era demanded. Her features were too strong, too definite, her dark eyes too direct in their gaze. But she possessed something more durable than prettiness, an incandescent force of personality that contemporaries struggled to describe without reaching for metaphors of electricity or fire. She was 19 when she met Lord Randolph Churchill at a regatta in Cowes in the summer of 1873. 3 days later he proposed. 3 days. It was, even by the standards of the age, extraordinary. The negotiations between Leonard Jerome and the Duke of Marlborough, Lord Randolph's father, were protracted, contentious, and revealing. The Duke made no secret of his distaste for an American match. The Jeromes were in trade after all, or close enough to it as made no difference. But Lord Randolph was the younger son, unlikely to inherit the dukedom, and the Jerome fortune, while not Vanderbilt scale, was substantial enough to make the Duke swallow his objections. A settlement was reached, £50,000 to be held in trust for Jenny's use. In return, Jenny Jerome became Lady Randolph Churchill. And in return for that, England got Winston. Winston Churchill was born on November 30, 1874, less than 8 months after his parents' wedding. A timing that prompted much calculation and little comment in polite society. His mother would shape him in ways that went far beyond the biological. While Lord Randolph pursued a dazzling but self-destructive political career, rising to Chancellor of the Exchequer before his mental deterioration brought him down, Jenny was the constant, the engine, the force. She knew everyone. She wielded influence with the precision of a surgeon and the instincts of a general. She wrote political journalism. She edited a literary magazine. She had, at various points, relationships with the Prince of Wales, the King of Prussia, and a Romanian nobleman 20 years her junior. Jenny Jerome's settlement, £50,000 in trust, roughly $4 million today. Her son Winston Churchill estimated that his mother's social and political connections were worth more to his early career than any formal introduction. When Winston Churchill was struggling to establish himself as a young politician in the 1900s, it was his mother who opened the doors. Her network, built over 3 decades of relentless social navigation, of dinners attended and letters written and debts carefully accumulated, was his inheritance as surely as any financial legacy. She lobbied for his advancement, placed articles in sympathetic newspapers, introduced him to the people who would become his earliest patrons. She was, in her son's own estimation, less like a mother than like a brilliant older sister. Jenny Jerome married twice more after Lord Randolph's death in 1895. First to a man 20 years her junior, then to another man 20 years her junior, demonstrating a preference for youth that scandalized and delighted Edwardian society in equal measure. She died in 1921 at 67 of complications following a fall. She had been wearing high-heeled shoes. Naturally, her son would go on to lead Britain through its darkest hours. But the particular quality that made him capable of it, the audacity, the theatrical self-belief, the absolute refusal to accept that any situation was beyond retrieval, that was American. That was Jenny. She did not give England a statesman. She gave England the conviction that statesmen were possible. Chapter 3, The Railroad Princess, Mary Leiter. The woman who became the Vicereine of India. In the spring of 1895, while Consuelo Vanderbilt was still fighting her mother over the Duke of Marlborough, a young woman named Mary Leiter was quietly becoming something almost without precedent in the British Empire, an American-born Vicereine of India. The title she would carry, Vicereine, the wife of the Viceroy, the king's representative on the subcontinent, was one of the most magnificent in the world. It came with a palace in Calcutta, one in Simla, a ceremonial household of hundreds, and the formal precedence of a sovereign princess. That it came to rest on the shoulders of a Chicago dry goods merchant's daughter was, to much of British society, almost incomprehensible. Mary Leiter's father, Levi Leiter, had built one of the great American retail fortunes as a partner in what would eventually become Marshall Field and Company. Chicago in the 1870s and 1880s was a city of raw volcanic growth, and Levi Leiter had ridden its energy to a fortune estimated at $30 million by the time of his retirement. Unlike many of his contemporaries, he was neither ostentatious nor reckless. He invested carefully, managed shrewdly, and spent the considerable intellectual energy left over from commerce on ensuring that his children were educated, traveled, and presented to society with every possible advantage. Mary was his most remarkable investment. She was tall, graceful, possessed of a genuine intellectual seriousness unusual among the daughters of wealth. She had studied with tutors in Washington, where the Leiter family had established itself in a mansion on New Hampshire Avenue, and she had made herself, by her mid-20s, into one of the most accomplished hostesses in the capital. She knew politics, she knew literature, she knew the diplomatic protocols of a dozen nations. She was exactly the kind of woman, in short, who ought to have been born into the English aristocracy. She met George Curzon in Washington in 1890. He was 29, already marked by everyone who encountered him as a man destined for great things. Brilliant, arrogant, astonishingly hardworking, constitutionally incapable of mediocrity. He was also, despite his family's ancient lineage, not a rich man. The Curzon barony was prestigious but not prosperous. Mary Leiter's $30 million background was not irrelevant to his calculations, though it was never the whole story. They were, in a genuine sense, a matched pair. Two people of tremendous capability drawn together by mutual recognition as much as by love. Mary Leiter brought an estimated $5 million dowry to her marriage to Curzon. Funds that financed his political career and, eventually, the magnificence of his viceroyalty. Curzon's annual viceregal budget was supplemented substantially by Leiter capital throughout his tenure. They married in 1895, and within 4 years George Curzon had been appointed Viceroy of India, the youngest man ever to hold the office at 39. Mary Leiter Curzon became the vicereine, and she threw herself into the role with the comprehensive dedication she brought to everything. She dressed magnificently. Her gowns, ordered from the greatest houses of Paris and London, were events in themselves. She entertained on a scale that awed even seasoned members of the Calcutta establishment. She studied the history, the religions, the art of the subcontinent with genuine scholarly appetite, and her letters from India, published posthumously, reveal a mind of unusual depth and sensitivity. But the viceroyalty consumed her. The climate was brutal for a constitution never entirely robust. She suffered recurrent illnesses that her doctors treated with the limited tools of the era and the even more limited understanding of tropical disease that prevailed at the turn of the century. She returned to England for treatment twice, each time rallying enough to travel back to India, driven by devotion to her husband and to the work. In 1906, at 36 years old, Mary Leiter Curzon died in England, her health finally broken. George Curzon would go on to serve as Foreign Secretary, very nearly becoming Prime Minister. He mourned Mary with a public intensity that was, for a man of his emotional reticence, almost shocking. He built her a monument. He endowed charitable institutions in her name. He wore her memory like a standard. And when the question arose of how the viceroyalty itself had been financed in those first critical years, the receptions, the magnificent entertainments, the formal splendors that had projected imperial power across the subcontinent, the answer always came back to Chicago. It always came back to Levi Leiter's dry goods. She gave an empire its spectacle, and the empire gave her an early grave. Chapter 4. The Iron Heiress. Consuelo Iznaga. The Yankee who scandalized 2 continents. Not every dollar princess arrived at the altar weeping. Some arrived with their eyes entirely open, their calculations precise, their ambitions clear. Of all the American women who crossed the Atlantic in search of titles, few navigated the transaction with more cool intelligence, or more brazen self-determination, than Consuelo Iznaga, who in 1876 became the Viscountess Mandeville and eventually the Duchess of Manchester. The Iznaga family occupied an unusual position in the topography of American wealth. Of Cuban-Spanish origin, they had built a substantial fortune in Louisiana sugar and were socially established in both New York and Newport. Wealthy enough to matter, exotic enough to fascinate, and sufficiently independent of the rigid social hierarchies of old New York to operate by their own rules. Consuelo Iznaga had grown up with this freedom, and she had no intention of surrendering it merely because she was crossing an ocean. She was 21 when she married Viscount Mandeville, heir to the Dukedom of Manchester, in a ceremony that attracted enormous attention on both sides of the Atlantic. The Manchester Dukedom was, like so many of its contemporaries, distinguished in title and depleted in resources. The Mandeville estate at Kimbolton Castle was ancient and impressive and desperately in need of the kind of financial intervention that only American money could provide. The Isnaga settlement, approximately $500,000 with additional income guarantees, was sufficient to begin the work of restoration. But what made Consuelo Isnaga's story distinctive was not the mechanics of the deal. It was what she did with the position once she had it. Unlike Consuelo Vanderbilt, who submitted to the role of ornamental duchess with barely concealed misery, Consuelo Isnaga embraced hers with genuine relish. Not because she was content to be decorative, but because she understood that the position was a platform and she intended to use it as one. The Isnaga settlement was among the first formally documented Anglo-American aristocratic marriages, establishing a template that would be replicated more than 400 times over the following 4 decades. She became, in the phrase of the era, a great social personality, which meant something very specific in the England of the 1880s and 1890s. It meant she was a power. She entertained at Kimbolton and in London with the strategic brilliance of a military campaign. Her guest lists were studied and gossiped over. Her friendships were currency. The Prince of Wales was among her intimates, which meant that her house was among the houses where the real politics of the era were conducted over dinner and cards, in the hours after the official discussions had concluded. She was also, by all accounts, genuinely funny, a quality rare enough in the Duchess of Manchester's social world to be treated almost as an eccentricity. Her wit was American in its directness, its willingness to puncture pretension, its democratic assumption that a good joke was a good joke regardless of who was being made to look foolish. She deployed it on dukes and princes with an impartiality that people found simultaneously alarming and irresistible. Her marriage was not happy in the conventional sense. Her husband, who became the 8th Duke of Manchester upon his father's death in 1890, was a man of limited capacities and unlimited appetites, for gambling primarily, which consumed with methodical efficiency the very fortune his wife had brought to their union. By the time of his death in 1892, a significant portion of the Isnaga money had been redistributed among London's gaming establishments. Consuelo faced this diminishment with characteristic equanimity. She outlived him by 14 years, dying in 1909, and the social world she had helped create, the interconnected Anglo-American aristocracy of the Edwardian era, in which American money and English titles were so thoroughly intertwined as to have become a single system, carried her imprint long after her name was largely forgotten. She bought her way into a world that did not want her and then made herself indispensable to it. Chapter 5. The Banker's Daughter, Minnie Stevens. The social climber who became a social institution. There is a particular cruelty embedded in the machinery of Gilded Age society. A machinery designed not merely to exclude but to make exclusion feel inevitable, natural, even just. The people who built that machinery, who polished its teeth and kept its gears oiled, were the women of what Ward McAllister, the era's self-appointed social arbiter, called the 400. The number of people he claimed that New York society could accommodate without discomfort. Everyone else knocked at the door and waited. Minnie Stevens knocked very loudly, and when the door was not opened she went around to the back and then to the side, and eventually built her own house next door with better furniture than everyone else's. Mary Fisk Stevens, Minnie to everyone who knew her, was the daughter of Perron Stevens, a hotelier who had made a substantial fortune operating some of the finest hotels in Boston and New York. The Stevens family was rich but not quite fashionable, which in the America of the 1870s was a distinction as rigid and meaningful as anything the old world could devise. Minnie had grown up in hotel dining rooms, surrounded by the architecture of other people's elegance, absorbing its grammar without being admitted to full membership in its language. What she possessed in compensation was remarkable social intelligence. the ability to read a room, to identify who mattered and why they mattered, and to position herself in relationship to power with the unerring instinct of a chess player thinking 4 moves ahead. When her mother took the family to Europe in the late 1860s and 1870s, Minnie studied the British aristocracy with the same focused attention she brought to everything. She understood, before most of her American contemporaries did, that the British aristocracy was a system, and that systems, unlike individual humans, could be learned and navigated. The Stevens hotels generated annual revenues of over $2 million at their peak, roughly $55 million today, making the family wealthy enough to support Minnie's European ambitions in style. She married Arthur Paget, an officer in the British Army and the son of Lord Alfred Paget, in 1871, one of the earliest and most closely watched of the Anglo-American matches. The marriage gave her a position in London society, but more importantly it gave her a base of operations. Lady Paget, as Minnie Stevens became, spent the next 3 decades constructing what can only be described as a social empire. She was famous for her parties, not merely as events, but as carefully engineered occasions at which the right people met each other at precisely the right moment. She introduced American heiresses to eligible British peers. She smoothed the path of countless dollar princess marriages, counseling anxious mothers on the protocols of English society, advising on the appropriate size of dowries, warning against specific men whose financial situations were worse than reported. She became, in effect, the unofficial coordinator of the entire transatlantic marriage market, a role she performed with the enthusiasm of a woman who understood that her own position depended on the continued vitality of the system she served. She was also, in her later years, something more interesting than a social arranger. The journals she kept throughout her life, portions of which were published after her death, reveal a woman of genuine, searching intelligence, deeply aware of the ironies of her position, capable of critiquing the very social machinery she had spent her life operating. She knew that the marriages she helped arrange were transactions. She knew that the women she shepherded across the Atlantic were, in many cases, exchanging their freedom for their titles. She arranged them anyway, and she wrote about the tension with an honesty that her public persona carefully concealed. Minnie Stevens Paget died in 1919, in a world so fundamentally different from the one she had been born into that her life's work, the careful construction of an Anglo-American aristocratic nexus, had been rendered almost meaningless by 4 years of a war that had killed the flower of the very aristocracy she had spent 50 years cultivating. She built the bridge between 2 worlds and then watched both worlds burn. Chapter 6. The Oil Heiress, Almina Womwell, the woman behind Downton Abbey. In the autumn of 1895, a young woman of uncertain parentage and certain wealth walked up the steps of Highclere Castle in Hampshire. A house so magnificent, so theatrically Gothic in its Victorian splendor, that it would one day serve as the set for the most watched period drama in television history. The young woman's name was Almina Womwell. Her mother was Marie Boyer, the recognized mistress of Alfred de Rothschild, the banking heir. Her father was, officially, Frederick Womwell, a cavalry officer of no particular distinction. Whether these designations corresponded to biological reality was a question that contemporary society chose, with elaborate discretion, not to ask. What was not in question was the money. Alfred de Rothschild, who attended the wedding and paid for the celebration and endowed the marriage with a dowry of £500,000, approximately $65 million today, made no secret of his devotion to Almina, whatever its precise nature. He had educated her, dressed her magnificently, introduced her to the finest houses in England and France, and had, by the time of her marriage at 19, equipped her with every social and cultural grace the era demanded. The man she married was George Herbert, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, 30 years old, the owner of Highclere Castle and its 26,000 surrounding acres, chronically short of funds, and in need of a financial transfusion of exactly the kind Alfred de Rothschild was prepared to provide. The marriage was negotiated with the frank efficiency that characterized the best of these transactions. The Rothschild money would fund the restoration of Highclere, finance the Earl's passion for horse racing, and eventually pay for the archaeological expeditions to Egypt that would make the Carnarvon name immortal. Alfred de Rothschild's dowry for Almina. £500,000, approximately £65 million, $82 million, today. This single endowment funded not only Highclere's restoration but Lord Carnarvon's Egyptian excavations, including the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922. For it was Lord Carnarvon who bankrolled Howard Carter's 20 years of excavation in the Valley of the Kings, an effort that culminated in November 1922, in the discovery of the most intact royal tomb in archaeological history, the burial place of the pharaoh Tutankhamun. The gold that glittered in Carter's lamplight that November afternoon, the golden mask, the golden shrine, the extraordinary panoply of objects that had lain undisturbed for 3,300 years, was accessible because Almina's Rothschild dowry had kept the expedition funded through 2 decades of finding nothing. Almina herself was remarkable in ways that went beyond her financial significance. During the First World War, she converted Highclere Castle into a convalescent hospital for wounded officers, funding it almost entirely out of her own pocket, hiring the best physicians in England, purchasing the most advanced medical equipment available. She trained as a nurse herself. She sat with dying men in the night. She wrote letters to their mothers. She performed, in the anonymous context of wartime nursing, acts of genuine human compassion that had nothing to do with titles or dowries or the social machinery of the Gilded Age. Her marriage was turbulent. Lord Carnarvon was difficult, temperamental, given to long absences. But it endured until his death in 1923, shortly after the discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb. Whether the famous mummy's curse was responsible for his demise, or whether it was, as more prosaic medicine suggested, blood poisoning from an infected mosquito bite, the romantic imagination of the world chose the former explanation. Almina had been a countess for 28 years. She had funded the restoration of a great English house, the discovery of an ancient Egyptian king, and a wartime hospital that saved hundreds of lives. She spent the rest of her long life living in comparative modesty, the fortune largely gone, the castle no longer hers. But Highclere still stands, and Tutankhamun's golden mask still shines in the Cairo Museum. And every autumn, on the lawns of the castle that Almina's Rothschild money saved, visitors arrive to photograph what they know as Downton Abbey, and none of them have ever heard her name. She bought a castle, a pharaoh, and immortality, and history forgot to put her name on any of them. Chapter 7. The Suffragist Duchess, May Gowlet. The heiress who used her title as a weapon. There is a moment in the life of every woman who has been bought and sold by the social machinery of her era, when the mechanism becomes visible. When the gears show through the gilding. For some women that moment arrives too late to be useful. For May Gowlet, who became the Duchess of Roxburghe in 1903, it arrived early enough that she had time to do something extraordinary with what she saw. The Gowlet family had built one of the quietest and most enduring fortunes in New York through real estate, specifically through the ownership of enormous tracts of Manhattan land that the city's relentless expansion turned, decade by decade, into gold. By the time May Gowlet came of age in the late 1890s, the family was worth an estimated $100 million, making her one of the richest potential brides in the United States. The competition for her hand was accordingly intense, a fact that she observed with a detachment remarkable in someone so young. She chose Henry Innisker, the 8th Duke of Roxburghe, partly because Flore's castle in Scotland appealed to her aesthetic sensibility and partly, one suspects, because the Duke was quieter and less demanding than most of the men who presented themselves. He was not a man of great intellectual force or political ambition. He hunted. He managed his estates. He was, in the vocabulary of the era, a thoroughly good sort. This suited May perfectly, because what May Gillette Roxbiggy wanted was not a husband but a platform. The Gillette family Manhattan real estate holdings were valued at over $100 million by 1900, one of the 5 largest fortunes in the United States. May Gillette's settlement with the Duke of Roxbiggy included Floors Castle's full renovation, which cost approximately £200,000. She had read the suffrage literature. She had attended the lectures. She understood, with the same cool analytical intelligence she brought to the social landscape, that the systematic exclusion of women from political life was not merely an injustice but a specific engineered mechanism, maintained by the same class of men who organized themselves into parliaments and clubs and attended each other's dinners and shot each other's pheasants and conducted the entire business of governance as a conversation among themselves. As Duchess of Roxbiggy, May had access to that conversation. She used it. She was not a militant. She did not chain herself to railings or throw herself before horses. Her methods were the methods of the class she had married into. Dinner parties, correspondence, personal influence, the patient accumulation of obligation. She cultivated relationships with progressive politicians. She funded suffrage organizations with quiet discretion. She used Floors Castle for meetings that did not appear in any official records. Her greatest contribution to the cause was perhaps the most ironic. She demonstrated by her own existence the absurdity of the system. Here was a woman of extraordinary intelligence and capability, who controlled more capital than most of the men in Parliament, who could restore a ducal castle and manage its complex business affairs with the same facility she brought to the diplomatic management of a dinner table, and yet she was not permitted to vote. The contradiction was visible to anyone who spent time in her company, and May made sure that a great many influential people spent time in her company. When women in Britain were finally granted the vote in 1918, first to those over 30 who met property requirements and eventually in 1928 on equal terms with men, the achievement had many mothers. May Gillette Roxbiggy was among them, though her name appeared in none of the victory speeches. She had worked in the background as women were required to work, and the background had as always remained invisible. She died in 1937, having outlasted the Edwardian world she had married into by a quarter century. Floors Castle, its restoration complete, remained in the Roxbiggy family. Her money had made it possible. Her intelligence had made it matter. She bought a title and used it to dismantle the walls that titles were built to maintain. Chapter 8. The Self-Made Princess, Nan Price. The actress who became a Contessa. Not all of the women who crossed the Atlantic in search of titles were daughters of inherited wealth. The Gilded Age was, above all else, an era of self-invention, a period in which the categories of class and birth that had governed European society for centuries were being dissolved in America by the universal solvent of money. And if money could be made as easily as it could in the America of the 1880s and 1890s, then the daughters of the self-made were not obligated to remain in the social category of their birth. The woman who called herself Nan Price was born Nancy Ann Pritchard in Cincinnati in 1872, the daughter of a moderately successful hardware merchant. She had no particular fortune, no distinguished family connections, and no formal education beyond what the public schools of Ohio provided. What she had was a face of startling beauty, a voice of professional quality, and the particular audacity of a woman who had understood from a very young age that the rules governing other people's lives did not necessarily apply to her. She arrived in New York at 17, found her way to the stage within a year, and by the mid-1890s had become one of the most discussed young actresses in the city, not only for her talent, which was genuine, but for the intelligence and seriousness with which she approached her work. She read. She studied languages. She refused the social category of actress, as her contemporaries understood it. The assumption that a woman who performed for money had implicitly agreed to be available for other forms of transaction, with a haughtiness that contemporaries found simultaneously admirable and baffling. By 1898, Nan Price commanded a salary of $500 per week on Broadway, roughly $18,000 per week today, making her financially independent at a time when most women of her background had no income of their own. She met Count Alessandro di Castelvetro at a reception in New York in 1899. He was 40, Italian, possessed of an ancient title and an ancestral villa in Tuscany that had not been adequately maintained since the Napoleonic Wars. He was also charming, cultured, and genuinely captivated by a woman whose intelligence and independence were so foreign to the women of his own class as to be nearly incomprehensible. He had come to America looking for an heiress. He found someone more interesting. The marriage caused a sensation in both countries. In America, the newspapers treated it as a fairy tale. The Cincinnati hardware merchant's daughter who became an Italian contessa. In Italy, the response was somewhat less celebratory. The Castelvetro family received the news with an aristocratic horror that gradually gave way, over the years that followed, to a grudging acknowledgement that the Contessa's American energy was precisely what the ancient villa and its neglected estate required. What Nan Price brought to Castelvetro was not merely the savings she had accumulated from a decade of professional work, but the far more valuable commodity of her own capacity. She managed the estate. She modernized the farming practices. She negotiated with the local merchants and bankers with the same directness she had deployed on New York theater producers. Within a decade, the estate was profitable for the first time in living memory. The Count, who had grown up with the quiet despair of a man who knew his inheritance was dissolving around him, watched his wife's transformation of his ancestral home with an amazement that deepened, over the years, into something resembling genuine love. She outlived him by 30 years, living in the Tuscan villa until her death in 1951, an ancient woman in a room full of American novels and Italian sunlight. A Cincinnati hardware merchant's daughter who had invented herself so thoroughly that by the end even she could not have said with certainty who she had been at the beginning. She had no fortune to spend and no family to trade. Only herself, which turned out to be more than sufficient. Chapter 9. The Reluctant Empress. Winneretta Singer. The sewing machine heiress who funded modernism. The story of the Dollar Princesses is, at its core, a story about what wealth does when it encounters culture. About the particular alchemy that occurs when American money, unencumbered by centuries of aristocratic tradition, meets the artistic and intellectual ferment of European modernity. No single figure embodies this alchemy more completely or more strangely than Winneretta Singer, the sewing machine heiress who became a princess of France and used her inherited fortune to change the course of Western music. Winneretta Singer was the 20th child of Isaac Merritt Singer, the sewing machine inventor and manufacturer whose name became synonymous, in the second half of the 19th century, with one of the most consequential technologies of the Industrial Revolution. Isaac Singer's fortune by the time of his death in 1875 exceeded $14 million, roughly $500 million today, and was distributed among the extraordinary number of children he had produced by an equally extraordinary number of women. Winneretta, born in 1865 to his third wife, Isabella Boyer, was among the heirs. Isaac Singer's estate, $14 million at death, c. $500 million today, distributed among 24 acknowledged children. Winneretta's share financed a musical salon that commissioned works from Faure, Stravinsky, Debussy, de Falla, Satie, and dozens of other composers across 4 decades. She was not a typical heiress. From her earliest years, Winneretta was oriented not toward the social world but toward the artistic one. Toward music specifically, which she approached with the systematic passion of someone who understood that it was not merely entertainment but the deepest available form of human communication. She studied piano with serious teachers. She composed. She attended every performance of consequence in Paris and London. And she thought with a clarity that the conventional social machinery of her era made very difficult for women to act upon, about what she wanted her life to be. What she wanted was not a husband. This was, in the France of the 1880s, essentially non-negotiable for a woman of her position. A wealthy American-born woman of good family was expected to marry, and marriage was the mechanism by which wealth was transferred and social position secured. Winnaretta submitted to the mechanism twice. First in a brief, disastrous union with Prince Louis de Saint-Montbéliard in 1887, annulled within a year, and then in 1893 in a marriage to Prince Edmond de Polignac that proved, against all apparent odds, to be deeply satisfying to both parties. Prince Edmund was 60 years old, homosexual, gentle, musical, and entirely content with a marriage that was, in its domestic arrangements, essentially a friendship between two people who shared a passionate love of music and a mutual interest in conducting their private lives without interference. He gave Winnaretta the Polignac title and the social legitimacy that came with one of France's most ancient names. She gave him the resources to pursue his own musical compositions and the social infrastructure of the salon that she proceeded to create in their house on the Avenue Henri Martin. The Polignac Salon became, over the following decades, one of the most important institutions in European musical life. Winnaretta commissioned works from Gabriel Fauré, Claude Debussy, Igor Stravinsky, Manuel de Falla, Eric Say, Francis Poulenc, and dozens of other composers. She financed premieres. She underwrote entire concert seasons. She paid for the composition of works that might not otherwise have found a patron, including Stravinsky's Renard, de Falla's El Retablo de Maese Pedro, and numerous other pieces that now form part of the permanent repertoire of Western music. She was doing, in the musical world, precisely what Carnegie and Vanderbilt were doing in the architectural world: purchasing permanence for art that might otherwise have been lost. Prince Edmund died in 1901, leaving Winnaretta as the Princesse de Polignac, one of the most powerful women in European cultural life. She continued the salon for another 4 decades, through the First World War, through the social revolutions of the 1920s, through the rise of fascism and the approach of another catastrophic conflict. He gave away millions. She funded hospitals and schools alongside the concert halls and composition prizes. She died in London in 1943, 90 years old, the sewing machine fortune largely dispersed into the cultural life of a continent. Every performance of a work she commissioned is her monument. The music she made possible fills concert halls from Tokyo to Buenos Aires. And in almost none of the program's notes that accompany those performances is her name mentioned at all. She did not want history to notice her. She wanted music to outlast history. She succeeded at both. Chapter 10. The Generation That Followed, Legacy and Reckoning. What was bought, what was lost, and what endured. The summer of 1914 was the last summer of the world that the Dollar Princesses had helped to build. On the lawns of the great English country houses, Blenheim, Kimbolton, Highclere, Floors, the rituals of Edwardian aristocracy continued. The house parties, the cricket matches, the languid afternoons of croquet on perfectly maintained grass. The women who had funded those lawns with American railroad money and copper fortunes were, by this point, well into middle age. Their children were being dispatched to the fronts of Belgium and France. The world they had purchased so expensively at such personal cost was about to be unmade. The First World War killed the Edwardian aristocracy as completely as any revolution could have done. In 4 years of industrial slaughter, the young men who had been educated at Eton and Oxford and installed in the great houses of England were erased. The butlers' rooms at Blenheim were converted to military purposes. Highclere became a hospital. The death duties imposed on great estates after the war made the maintenance of houses that had always required enormous subsidy even more difficult, and the American subsidies were no longer available. The fortunes that had crossed the Atlantic had, in many cases, been spent. The pipeline was closed. Of the Dollar Princesses themselves, those who survived the war did so in a world that had changed beyond recognition. Consuelo Vanderbilt Marlborough, long since separated from her duke, her annulment finally granted in 1926, became a figure of Edwardian nostalgia. Her memoir, published in 1952, her life celebrated as a cautionary tale and a romance in approximately equal measure. She died in 1964 at 87, having seen the social world that had purchased her dissolve utterly and something new, stranger, more uncertain, emerge in its place. The legacies they left were as varied as their characters. The buildings they funded still stand: Blenheim, a World Heritage Site; Highclere, a television phenomenon; Floors Castle, still in the Roxburgh family. The music Winnaretta Singer commissions still plays. Winston Churchill's extraordinary speeches, shaped by the American audacity of his mother's bloodline, still move people who read them a century later. The archaeological treasures that Almina Carnarvon's Rothschild dowry made possible still draw millions to the Cairo Museum every year. Of the estimated $500 million transferred from America to Europe in aristocratic dowries between 1870 and 1914, historians estimate that a significant proportion funded cultural institutions, architectural restorations, and charitable enterprises that survive to the present day. The cultural return on this investment, while impossible to quantify, was incalculable. What was lost is harder to account. 400 women crossed the Atlantic carrying the hopes of their ambitious mothers and the fortunes of their industrial fathers. Some found in their titled marriages something resembling happiness, or at least the productive satisfaction of a significant life. Many did not. The letters that survive, those that have been preserved in archives and published in biographies, suggest with uncomfortable frequency the particular loneliness of a woman who has been valued for what she carries rather than who she is. The hollow performance of identity that was required in a world where your role had been decided before you arrived at the altar. But it would be a mistake, and a patronizing one, to read their stories only as tragedies. The dollar princesses were not merely victims of their era, though the era made victims of them in real and specific ways. They were also agents, women who, within the constraints available to them, exercised genuine intelligence and genuine will. Jenny Jerome shaped a prime minister. Mary Curzon governed in her husband's shadow, a continent. Winnaretta Singer underwrote an era's most vital music. May Golet Roxburgh used her title to push against the very system that had produced it. Even Consuelo Vanderbilt, whose marriage began in tears and coercion, found in the end a life of her own making, spent in the service of causes she had chosen. The movement they represented, the extraordinary, temporary, historically peculiar experiment of American money purchasing European aristocratic permanence, ended with the war that killed the aristocracy itself. But its consequences persisted. The Anglo-American establishment that dominated the 20th century, the shared institutions, the diplomatic intimacy, the cultural interchange, was built in part on the foundations these women had laid. The personal connections their marriages created, the social networks that stretched from Fifth Avenue to Mayfair, the mutual intelligibility of two very different cultures that was established over decades of dinners and drawing rooms and house parties. All of this created a substrate of relationship that proved, when the crucial moments arrived, to be something more than merely social. When Winston Churchill, in the darkest summer of 1940, needed to convince Franklin Roosevelt that Britain was worth saving, he was not appealing to a stranger. He was appealing, in part, to a deep American familiarity with Britain that had been cultivated over 70 years by women who had moved between the two worlds carrying American money and British titles and something less quantifiable than either. A genuine understanding of both places, forged in the experience of belonging fully to neither. History did not put their names on this achievement. History rarely puts women's names on anything. The dollar princesses appear in the footnotes of the great men's biographies, in the financial appendices of architectural histories, in the acknowledgments of musicological studies. Their dowries are recorded. Their marriages are dated. Their deaths are noted. But in the long record of what human beings have done with wealth and ambition and the difficult freedom of being alive at a particular moment in history, their story is not a footnote. It is a chapter. A substantial, complex, morally serious chapter in the history of power and gender and the extraordinary lengths to which people will go in every era to make themselves permanent. The chandeliers still burn. The Edwardian summers are long over. But Blenheim's gardens bloom each spring. Tutankhamun's gold still shines. And somewhere in a concert hall in Vienna or New York or Tokyo, in the final bars of a piece commissioned 100 years ago by a sewing machine heiress who wanted music to outlast everything else, the consequence of a Gilded Age transaction is still being heard by people who do not know and were never told whom to thank. They were forgotten by the history they paid for. But the history did not forget what they built. The Ledger of Legacy. Between 1870 and 1914, 400 American women carried $500 million across the Atlantic Ocean. They carried it in dowries and in annual income guarantees. They carried it in letters of credit and in trust funds and in the personal relationships they built over decades of social navigation. They deposited it into the crumbling foundations of a civilization that was, though none of them could have known it, within a generation of its end. What they received in exchange. Titles, position, the particular permanence of marble and genealogy, proved in the long run more fragile than the money they had given away. The titles still exist, many of them though drained of their old political substance. The houses still stand, though managed now as tourist attractions and filming locations. The genealogies still appear in Debrett's peerage, the names of American grandmothers recorded in careful italic type, their origins noted without emphasis. But what endures most completely is something that was never accounted for in any settlement document: the consequence of intelligence applied to power. Jenny Jerome's son. Almina Carnarvon's pharaoh. Winnaretta Singer's music. Consuelo Vanderbilt's memoir, still in print, still read, still capable of making a reader feel the particular weight of a carriage door closing on a November morning in 1895. The forgotten Gilded Age heiresses were never truly forgotten by the world they made. They were only forgotten by the people who benefited from it. This too is a lesson. This too is history. This story changed the way you see history. If you'll never look at a palace, a title, or a great man the same way again, then don't let this be the last forgotten story we uncover. Subscribe and help this channel reach 1,000 subscribers. Be part of the first 1,000 who choose the stories beneath the chandeliers, the names history left in the footnotes. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which heiress stayed with you the most, and why? I'll see you in the next chapter.